Hello, 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 friends and comrades. Welcome to another episode of Upstream Shaik. This is the program where we swim upstream. We don't take the easy way. We don't go where they tell us to go. We don't, you know, have our minds brainwashed by the mass media and those internet websites that belong to the billionaires. We think for ourselves here. And so today I've got something very special here for you that I want to offer you. A few years ago, quite a few years ago now, we organized from the Zanian People's Organization, an organization that I also am a member of. We organized a rally called From Fraud to Freedom. The rally was titled Fraud to Freedom. And the title of the rally was intended to indicate that South Africa, instead of having been liberated in 1994, actually did not experience freedom but fraud under the leadership of the African National Congress. And this fraud is not only perpetrated by the ANC but is also endorsed and supported by big business South Africa. Although they make a pretense of being opposing to corruption, etc., we know now that big business actually are the main beneficiaries of corruption and of stupid legislation in South Africa. Every time a public service goes down or fails, they actually use that as a profit center. So, for example, the education sector, the health sector, etc., they use the collapse of these public services in order to create for themselves new business opportunities. And so a few years ago, we organized this rally, Fraud to Freedom, and we had some very, very good speakers there. And in particular, in this section, I want to talk about one of the speeches that we had at this rally. It's been published before, but I think since this channel is there now, I'd like to republish this lecture, and maybe we'll break away and I'll just offer you some commentary where I think that you might not be clued up with the things that are mentioned. And so I'll use the opportunity to jump in and pause the video, and we'll look at some of the ideas that Achmad Cassim is talking about. Now, for those of you who don't know Imam Achmad Cassim, he's one of my heroes. He's a revolutionary. He's a man who has not known a day of rest in his life. When he was a young man, he joined the struggle against apartheid. He was locked up when he was either not yet 20 or in his early 20s, and he spent many years in prison being tortured. When he was released, he got back where he stopped, and he started mobilizing in 1980 when I was a young student at school. He was behind the scenes within the revolutionary movement, directing the direction in which the struggle and the battle was being pursued against the enemy. And so over the years, through the 80s also, he was again sentenced to prison for invoking a revolutionary interpretation of the Holy Quran, and there is no other interpretation of the Holy Quran. And so with that revolutionary interpretation, he advanced the battle within the ranks of the Pan-Africanist Congress, following in the legacy of Imam Abdullah Harun, who in fact in the 60s already played his role as a revolutionary within that structure, within the Pan-Africanist Congress. And so when we organized this rally, From Fraud to Freedom, it was very important that we got Achmad Cassim's important views to be on display. And I beseech you to listen carefully. It's about 30 minutes. I will try to pause it here and there where it's absolutely necessary. But for the rest, you can just sit back and get enriched by the powerful words of Achmad Cassim. And so here we go.
Aman la is Zulet. Yeah, Africa. It is very difficult to posit all the problems that face us and at the same time be bold enough to propose some solutions. And yet that is our responsibility as revolutionaries. We are not reformist. We have never been reformist. We never ever believed in the unity of the oppressed and the oppressor. For all oppressors all over the world have no nation, they have no religion, and they don't belong to a specific class. The oppressed masses, on the other hand, form one formidable block of people, and in the current situation, by end of November, the world's population will be about 7 billion human beings. 80% of those people are termed illiterate, and 80% of those 80% are women. And the unemployment figures are now skyrocketing because of this global economic recession. Trevor Manuel, as well as Gil Marcus and Gordon, a few months ago, were saying that South Africa was not going to feel the impact of the global recession. And knowledgeable people just burst out laughing. We didn't know that we were living in what we call a prophylactic society. We are encased and protected from what is happening in the rest of the world.
Let me just tell you that Trevor Manuel and Gil Marcus, these are two prominent economic policymakers within the ANC previously, and still play a very prominent role behind the scenes as policymakers within, economic policymakers within the ANC.
So that is not true. So when we discuss our problems, we are in fact discussing the problems of Africa and the problems of the world. I never met the martyred hero of our society, Steve Biko. I met his co-accused, P.C. Jones, he will remember, here in Rylands, at the height of the struggle. But I read all, if not all, then most of his work, and I would recommend that all revolutionaries who are serious about revolution should start by reading chapter 19 in his book, I Write What I Like.
Chapter 19 in the book, I Write What I Like. I'll show you, give you a glimpse of this chapter. In this chapter, I write what I like. Steve Biko says, you are either alive and proud, or you are dead. And when you are dead, you can't care anyway. And your method of death can itself be a politicizing thing. So you die in the riots, for a hell of a lot of them. In fact, there's really nothing to lose. Almost literally, given the kind of situations that they come from. So if you can overcome the personal fear for death, which is a highly irrational thing, you know then you are on the way. And at another place in that chapter he says, my attitude is, I'm not going to allow them to carry out their program faithfully. What a powerful point to make. You know, it is, life is there and death is there. And if you can use your death to strike a blow to the enemy, so much the better. Everyone is going to die. And then the other point there that he makes is that the program of the enemy continues and is rolled out only when you are quiet. So don't be quiet. Let yourself count. Make yourself heard, make yourself felt. And I think that is the message that comes out of chapter 9.
It's a very short chapter. And that should give you a very clear idea of what his major contribution was. There are many intellectuals in our society, but not many of them have the guts, the bravery, the audacity to stand up against an oppressor. In the society in which I grew up, the majority of formal leaders were abject cowards. They didn't even want to stand up and protect Ash-Shahid, the martyr, Imam Abdullah Harun, when he was killed in detention, same month, but a different year.
He's referring, of course, to the Muslim Judicial Council, the clerical body to which martyr Shahid Abdullah Harun belonged to. Not one of his colleagues raised an objection, nothing, no public outcry at the time of his murder. And so rightfully, Imam here is identifying the MJC as nothing but a bunch of cowards.
When Imam Harun was killed, I was in fact in prison at the time, serving my 5-year sentence. Do we really believe that we can move from fraud to freedom? Since when is fraud our starting point? Should we not be starting somewhere else? So I am not comfortable starting with fraud, because the biggest fraud perpetrated against the indigenous of the African continent and in Latin America and in Asia was the lie that Europeans are superior to other so-called races. That was the biggest fraud perpetrated, bolstered by the science, so-called science of anthropology. We were boxed, wrapped up, and that's where we stayed, and they even put Christmas wrapping and roses on the boxes. But we remained inside the boxes, and that's where we are still stuck today. We first realized this when affirmative action was applauded even by white liberals, even by Max Price, the Vice Chancellor of UCT. After he spoke, I went to him, I said, "Excuse me, do you really support affirmative action?" And he said, "Yes." So I said, "You know what you are doing? When you affirm affirmative action, you are affirming the racial categories which apartheid put you under during the 1950 Population Registration Act. So you were whites, coloreds, other coloreds, mixed coloreds, Indians or Asiatics, and either Bantu or blacks, etc. And this went on. So coloreds became the rubbish bin of the classification system. And today I am still stuck there. At a COSATU meeting, a shop steward from Mitchell's Plain here at Community House spoke before I did. He was the first speaker. And he spoke for 20 minutes on the origins of the colored people. And after it was finished, they gave me the opportunity to speak. My first question to the audience was, can all the coloreds in the hall kindly put up their hands? And then he was shocked and I was shocked. Nobody put up their hands. And that was the end of the history of the colored people. Okay. The reason being very simple, that not even in accepted scientific practice is there a definition of race or races. There's only one race, the human race. I read Steve Bantu Biko's words with the attention that it deserves. And I found only on one occasion in about 200 pages did he make a slip up. Just once. And I'm sure if the editor had picked that up, he would have corrected it. So my understanding of the message of black consciousness, I've got no problem with black consciousness. I do have a major problem with black unconsciousness.
That's a very, very, very important point. Let me just remind you of the words of Biko, where he says, being black is not a matter of pigmentation. Being black is a reflection of a mental attitude. Extremely important idea, because there's a complete misconception about what black consciousness is. You know, black consciousness, there would not be a need for black consciousness if there was no such a thing as white central Eurocentrism. If there was never a thing such as white racism, because white racism is something very unique in the history of mankind. It's the first time that I can think of, and I've read quite a bit of history, where a particular segment of the human race elevated themselves on the basis of their pigmentation. I cannot think during Roman times, because even during Roman times there were even African emperors, there were Caesars that emanated from African blood. And so it is really since the 1400s, 1500s, when Europe became a powerful part of the world, that white racism emerges as a factor. And so black consciousness was probably unnecessary before the 1400s, before the Portuguese became powerful, and then the Dutch, and then the British, because all of them had one thing in common, and that was to elevate white people as some sort of advanced higher level of humanity. And what black consciousness is, it is an antidote, it is a response, it is a response by those who are not white. So you can either say not white consciousness, which would be a silly term. We can't use that term, not those who are not white, their consciousness. So what we as black consciousness upholders use or use the term black consciousness for is the consciousness of those who are declared not fully human by whites. So I want to also correct a mistaken idea that is emanating from North America under the influence of ultra-liberal, junky funky left-wingers in North America, where black consciousness is now converted to something that really means some form of pigmentation. It's nonsense. We do not see pigmentation as having much relevance. You know, there are people who fall in the camp of being not European who are fair-skinned, and that eliminates the idea that black consciousness is necessarily a black racist idea. Completely wrong. And I think Imam, the brother Achmad Cassim, he makes this point very importantly, in agreement with what you can see here, what Steve Biko has in fact said.
Marcus Garvey made a very telling point, 1919 thereabouts. He said that if you keep on referring to your skin color, then your thinking will always remain skin deep. Okay? What is important is what did this martyr mean when he spoke about consciousness? He was speaking about not the consciousness of being black, because that is what the apartheid regime kept on reminding us. You can't live here, you can't study here. I was born here, number 1 Queen Street, Mowbray, next to the mosque, 1945, 12th December. By the time I matriculated, I could not enter the University of Cape Town, which was half a kilometer up the hill. You had to apply to the Minister of the Interior. And then 58, the group areas kicked in, and out went the population in this area. District 6, same thing happened. But I'm not here to bore you with personal details. I want to get to the crux of the matter. In answer to the question, partly, where did we go wrong? But we should also say, what did we do right? It's very important. The mere fact that the human being has to identify innate qualities within himself. And innate human nature is everywhere the same and has always been like that. That has not changed. So Steve Biko did not say consciousness of being black. He said the consciousness of the blacks, which means the oppressed masses, and that consciousness is a human consciousness. It's a big difference. Now, unless we elevate our thinking to that level, we'll be trapped into these beautiful boxes which the Population Registration Act had put us. We don't deserve to be in there. We don't want to continue the rest of our existence in that fashion. Enough harm has been done in the whole world, and enough harm is being done right at this particular moment. So I salute every person who embraced, in the heat of the apartheid evil, the concept of black consciousness. It made a tremendous contribution for a person to stand up and say, I am a human being. I am not an invention of a white man, of a white system, an invention of colonialism and of anthropology. Now, a person whose books were lying on the table there, Franz Fanon, he has a number of students throughout the world. He has a number of students throughout the world. And one of those students, known as Bulhan, he wrote a book called The Psychology of the Oppressed, a brilliant book. He says, if you want to identify whether you are oppressed or not, just run the following checklist. And the acronym, the word which we use to memorize, whether we've got every point covered, is BEMIST, B-E-M-I-S-T. The B stands for bonding. When a mother gives birth to a child, and the father is proud and the mother is proud, and they live together and educate this child and secure this child, the bonding takes place. Would you just like to tell me, in the past week, how many children under 5 years old were kidnapped, raped, and killed only here in the Western Cape? Just think about that. Now, the African mothers didn't grow up in a culture where there was no education. They had the best of education possible, because the primary aim of education was, and must still be, to teach human beings how to live with other human beings. Not for whites how to live with blacks, or for blacks how to live with whites. That is absolute rubbish. Because in the process you dehumanize yourself. But what we need to learn is how to live with an oppressor, or how not to live with him. If he doesn't know how to walk on the earth, then put him inside the earth. Now, this bonding is a serious thing. When a baby catches the smell of its mother, that baby is contented. Under the slave trade, they broke this bonding. According to Basil Davidson in the book Black Mother, 100 million Africans were taken off the continent to the so-called New World. and 1/3 of them possibly died and were dumped in the Atlantic Ocean. Now, that bonding process was also destroyed, and especially here in the Western Cape. African men came in as contract laborers. Their wives had to stay in the Eastern Cape or other parts of the world. And that process has not healed. Right? Your influx control, your Job Reservation Act, etc. All of this broke this bonding. It also happens when family members are locked up for life imprisonment. Those bonds were broken. So bonding is a very serious issue for all sane human beings, because you must be nurtured by a mother and a father, and in the absence of any of them, the grandmother and grandfather or whoever else is available. The E stands for energy. All oppressive systems run on separating you from your source of energy, limiting your energy intake in order for you just to survive. The prisoners on Robben Island knew what it was to go through a 5-day hunger strike, or in Barberton, 11-day hunger strike. So they were pushed in wheelbarrows to the hospital. They were too weak. And on top of it, you were forced to labor in the stone quarry whilst you were on hunger strike. So people like Mike Mamani got an extra 9 months on his sentence because he fainted at work. So you got punished. Now the energy levels of this society, senseless talking about food security. Where is the food security of 80% of the population here in South Africa? There is no food security. Every Tuesday in my area, about 100 people descend on the dirt bins that are put out for the garbage collectors to just get something to eat. And one person was so stupid. He lives in my community here in Rylands. I live in Lansdowne. A white advocate said to him, you know, what you are seeing in your area also happens in the white areas. And says the white advocate, my wife now deliberately calls in the people who are eating out of the bins and prepares breakfast for them in her kitchen. And she feeds them. The person who lives in this community, he says, well, my wife puts extra bread in the dirt bin. How do you like that for Ubuntu? Okay. So when we are talking here of consciousness and struggling to define it, I can read off for you from memory 28 definitions of socialism. But all I would like to see, and people say, if you want to see what socialism is, just watch me for 24 hours per day. Then you've made your point. Our grandparents used to teach us, before you sit down for your supper, go and feed the birds and the rabbits and the geese. Feed them first. Now, how would you not feed a human being first before you sit down to eat? I come from a background where this concept is taught. It says if there is food enough for 2 people, invite the 3rd one. Now, if there's enough food for 20 million, it means there's enough food for 30 million. Yes. And that is the reality, with 8 million people unemployed. So if you want to call that socialism in action, sure, give me more of it. If you want to have a debate on what does socialism mean, invite me when you finish with the debate. Just tell me the conclusion. Okay? Now, the E for energy. They know a child who is well fed, a daily meal, proper breakfast, will be at least 3 centimeters taller than a person who doesn't have the benefit of a good meal every day. Now, if the food goes into your bloodstream, the same blood pumps to your head. It feeds the brain. And 20% of your energy and oxygen that you inhale goes to the brain. So what are we doing? Why are we shocked when students in grades 3, 6, and 9 cannot read and write? But more important, when teachers were tested, they couldn't answer the same examination papers they set for their students. Yeah. This is true. This is true. So here, everything hinges now on education. And education for all of us means to teach human beings how to live with other human beings. That's the bottom line. You can fail maths, you can fail science, you can fail geography, but you can't fail the course in human relationships. Then you are a disaster. Child abuse, abortions, unwanted pregnancies, they just escalate because of this lack of education. Who is a teacher? Steve Bantu Biko was a great teacher. Ashahid Imam Abdullah Harun was a magnificent teacher. Ashahid Imam Abdullah Harun was a magnificent teacher. What made them great as teachers? For the simple reason they understood that every human being, but especially teachers, have to be sincere seekers of the truth. Now, sincerity merely means the way you treat yourself. If you take yourself as a joke, why do you expect other people to treat you otherwise? It's very important. In other words, take a look at yourself as a human being without the mirror. See yourself. A writer, Franz Kafka, very difficult to read, very morbid writings in his novels. In a book called The Castle, there's one statement that struck me. He says, the blind person does not need advice on how to see, he needs help. This society needs help. It needs the help of those people who call themselves intellectuals. Because the primary goal, the main goal, and even the sole goal of an intellectual should be to raise the levels of consciousness of human beings. And that's what Steve Biko did, what Imam Harun did. So it's not merely deprivation that brings about revolution. It is consciousness of deprivation that spurs on the revolution. People can live as oppressed and oppressor for thousands of years without them knowing that they are deprived. But they must be made aware. Your bonding is destroyed, your energy resources are destroyed. I don't even want to touch alcohol. Many would think that is Cassim's pet hate. Drugs and alcohol. I've got 2 sons who are addicted, so don't talk to me. Take 2 examples. If you are alcohol dependent, however can you become intellectually independent? You can't. So these teachers were sincere seekers of the truth. Secondly, they are sincere spreaders of the truth. And they'd never ask a fee. If there is a teacher that wants to negotiate his salary before he teaches an illiterate person or an ignorant person, don't worry. You've already established what he is. There was a millionaire in Hollywood, and he wanted to court this young actress, and he said to her, "How will you spend the night with me in an hotel for $1 million?" So she said to him very coyly, "I'll consider it." So he said, "No, don't worry. I've already established you are a prostitute." You got it? You got it? Your job is to teach. And unlike many people believe, want to legalize prostitution, they say it's the oldest profession in the world. That's a blatant lie. The oldest profession in the world is learning and teaching. Because to become a prostitute, you've got to learn how to do it, and somebody's got to teach you how to do it. Let us then get to the third point of what the teacher is. Why Steve Biko and Imam Harun were such great individuals in that sense. Because they were exemplary. They set an example wherever they were. Anybody here who can recall Steve Biko not being exemplary, especially in public spaces? I remembered he was reprimanded once by another great revolutionary, and he took the warning very seriously. He took it very, very seriously. You don't have to reprimand an intelligent person in public. You call him aside and say, this is unbecoming. So this exemplary behavior is not seen. How do you feel when a school principal is charged for raping a student at the school? Or for impregnating schoolgirls, not 1 or 2, sometimes 10 or 12 at a time? Should he be there? I don't think so. And the fourth characteristic of these great teachers is that they are agents of social change, very correctly, but they are also agents for social change. When you teach a student maths, you are already an agent of social change, because that person will never see life the same again. But when you become an agent for social change, it means you've got an ideal, you've got a goal that you are working towards. And that perhaps should be the crux of the issue for AZAPO and other liberation organizations. What is the design of this ideal society that we are supposed to establish? Has anybody articulated it? Everybody knew they were against apartheid, but they didn't tell us what they were for. So post-apartheid was a rubbish concept. Post means after. So after apartheid, you could have something worse than apartheid. It's the same with getting rid of those leaders in the Middle East. Yes, they should go. The people should remove them. The big question is, what are you going to replace them with? Look at the mess in Iraq, created by America. That was America's ally for attacking Iran in 1982. So be very careful, clear about what we fight against, but also be very clear what we are fighting for. I believe the minimum thing that we should be fighting for a just social order, is that every human being, every citizen and non-citizen must at least receive 1 free meal every day. Remove the need for this person having to kill or to steal or to rob somebody else in order to eat. And if you can afford a meal, you will tell those who distribute the meal, rather give it to so-and-so. They are in greater need than I am. Secondly, I believe in a society which is, a social order, which is 100% sober from birth to death. 100% sober. You can take a look at all the stats: industrial accidents, spouse abuse, child abuse, robberies, right? Accidents, pedestrians walking in front of cars. It just goes on and on. The murder rate in South Africa has dropped from 20,000 per annum to 18,000, and they say that's a big improvement. And just as we were about to applaud, a mother kills 5 of her children in one go. They still don't know the reason. Let us be agents of social change, but also be agents for social change. And the third one, which is the one subject, you can wake me up any time of the day and night, and that is that we want to create a social order where there is 100% literacy. We must guarantee that every single human being in our society can read and write and understand what they are reading and writing. Once we've... Aman!
Okay, I've got the lecture up till that point. I hope you've enjoyed the words of Achmad Cassim as he addresses why we can describe our present dispensation in this beautiful South Africa of ours as fraud rather than as freedom. And just in closing, I think one of the points that stood out for me was that when he cited an author who says that when you have a person who is blind, you don't teach them to see. You actually have to take their hand and lead them. And describing the position of South Africa as a colonized nation that have maybe been liberated from formal colonization but still suffering, where our people still suffer intellectual and other forms, cultural colonization, and where the intellectual classes, or those who are the intellectuals in the society, need to offer direction instead of trying to impose some sort of democratic, helping people to see the light. I think the idea there is that the intellectuals need to play their role, and identifying Steve Biko, of course, and Abdullah Haroon, and there are many similar men and women in our time that we can assume or that we can adopt as those who are better at seeing our problems and identifying our problems and leading us forward. So I thank you for joining me in this episode.